The strongest people are rarely the ones standing under the brightest lights. They are the ones quietly knocking on someone else's door when no one is watching. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Ethan Walker followed the same familiar path through a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Seattle. Rain or sunshine, freezing winter winds or gentle spring mornings, the routine never changed. In one hand, he carried a small insulated bag filled with fresh homemade soup. In the other, a folded newspaper and a loaf of warm bread from the bakery that had just opened 3 blocks away. Most people driving past saw only an ordinary man in a faded blue plaid shirt and worn work boots. They never imagined that only 8 months earlier he had walked out of one of Seattle's most respected technology companies carrying everything he owned from his office inside a single cardboard box. Ethan never spoke about that day. He had discovered that painful memories became lighter when they were replaced with useful habits. After losing the career he had spent more than 15 years building, he accepted whatever honest work came his way. Some mornings he repaired broken fences. Other afternoons, he fixed computers for local families. On weekends, he assembled furniture, cleaned gutters, or helped neighbors install ceiling fans. None of the jobs made him wealthy, but every dollar helped him provide a stable home for his 12-year-old daughter, Lily, whose laughter remained the brightest part of every difficult day. As Ethan reached the small white house at the end of Maple Street, he smiled before he even knocked. The flower boxes beneath the front windows were blooming with bright yellow daisies that he had planted for Margaret Ellis at the beginning of spring. The elderly widow often joked that the flowers looked happier than she felt, but Ethan always answered with the same gentle smile. Flowers have a way of teaching us patience. He tapped softly on the front door exactly 3 times. That had become their tradition months earlier after Margaret admitted loud knocking startled her hearing aids. Usually the door opened within seconds, followed by her cheerful voice asking whether he had remembered to eat breakfast himself. This morning, however, silence greeted him instead. Ethan waited another moment before knocking again, still gently, still respectfully. The house remained quiet. His expression shifted from routine calm to quiet concern. Margaret had never forgotten their morning visit without leaving a note taped to the window. He glanced toward the driveway and noticed an unfamiliar black luxury sport utility vehicle parked beside the garage. The polished paint still carried droplets from the early morning rain. Someone had arrived before sunrise. Ethan adjusted the insulated soup bag in his hands and looked once more toward the front porch. Just as he considered calling Margaret's phone, he heard footsteps approaching from inside. Slow footsteps at first, then quicker ones. The brass doorknob turned. The front door opened only halfway before the woman standing inside suddenly froze. Ethan stopped breathing for a brief second, not because he was angry, but because he recognized the face immediately. Olivia Bennett, the woman who had dismissed him from Sterling Technologies in front of an entire conference room. Time seemed to stand perfectly still between them. Olivia's confident executive expression disappeared almost instantly, replaced by unmistakable disbelief. She stared at the insulated soup container, the loaf of fresh bread, and the newspaper tucked beneath Ethan's arm before slowly lifting her eyes to meet his. Ethan remained completely still, his voice calm, steady, and unexpectedly kind. "Good morning," he said with a polite nod. "I came to see Margaret. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came. Of all the doors she had expected to answer that morning, this was the one she never imagined would change everything she believed about the man she thought she had already left behind. Olivia Bennett remained motionless for several long seconds before finally stepping aside. "She has been asking about you all morning," she said quietly, her confident executive voice softened by something Ethan had never heard from her before. "Please come in." Ethan nodded politely without allowing surprise to change his expression. He walked into the familiar living room carrying the warm soup as though nothing unusual had happened. Margaret Ellis sat comfortably beneath a knitted blanket in her favorite chair beside the large front window. The moment she saw Ethan, her face brightened with the unmistakable joy of greeting family rather than a neighbor. "There you are," she laughed. "I was beginning to think the rain had finally scared you away." Ethan smiled as he placed the soup on the small wooden table beside her. "You know better than that. Chicken noodle today, just the way you like it." The bakery had fresh sourdough this morning too. Margaret reached for his hand with both of hers. "You always remember." Olivia stood quietly across the room, watching a side of Ethan that had never existed inside conference rooms, quarterly meetings, or executive presentations. Months earlier, she had believed she understood exactly who he was. The reserved systems manager who rarely spoke unless someone asked a direct question. The employee who never promoted himself. The quiet man who accepted difficult assignments without complaint. She had mistaken silence for a lack of leadership. Now she watched the same man gently fluff Margaret's pillow, adjust the thermostat 2 degrees warmer after noticing her hands felt cold, replace the batteries inside the television remote without being asked, and check the expiration dates on the medicine bottles sitting neatly beside the kitchen sink. Every movement appeared natural, practiced, and completely free of expectation. Margaret noticed Olivia's puzzled expression and smiled knowingly. "He has been doing all of that for months," she said proudly. "Sometimes I think he remembers my schedule better than I do." Ethan laughed softly. "Only because you keep trying to skip lunch whenever you get caught up reading mystery novels." Margaret pointed playfully toward a stack of paperbacks beside her chair. "Do not listen to him. He exaggerates." Olivia could not help smiling at the exchange. It felt genuine in a way that many corporate relationships never managed to become. She glanced around the house and quietly realized that nearly everything showed traces of Ethan's care. A repaired cabinet hinge, fresh flowers on the dining table, smoke detector batteries labeled with replacement dates, a carefully organized calendar filled with medical appointments, grocery deliveries, and reminders written in clear block letters. None of it carried his name. None of it asked for recognition. Margaret slowly looked toward her niece. "I told you on the phone that someone wonderful had been helping me. You were always so busy that I suppose I forgot to mention his name." Olivia lowered her eyes, unable to answer immediately. Ethan simply continued pouring soup into a bowl as though the conversation were about someone else entirely. Outside, gentle rain tapped against the windows while the house filled with the comforting aroma of warm broth and fresh bread. For the first time since opening the front door, Olivia began to understand that the man she had dismissed from her company had never stopped building something valuable. He had simply been building it where no performance review would ever measure its worth. Olivia remained at Margaret's house long after breakfast ended, although she had originally planned to return to her downtown office before noon. Every few minutes, she discovered another quiet reminder that Ethan had become part of Margaret's daily life without ever announcing his presence. He replaced the water filter beneath the kitchen sink before it reached its expiration date. He wrote large print grocery lists because Margaret admitted reading small handwriting had become difficult. He even labeled the thermostat with simple instructions so she would never become confused during cold winter evenings. None of those details appeared extraordinary by themselves, yet together they painted the portrait of someone who had chosen consistency over recognition. Ethan never behaved as though he deserved praise. When Margaret thanked him for repairing a loose porch railing the previous weekend, he simply smiled and asked whether she had remembered to water the daisies before yesterday's rain. Olivia watched the conversation unfold with growing discomfort. Inside Sterling Technologies, she had spent years rewarding employees who confidently presented accomplishments during meetings. Ethan had almost never spoken unless technical problems demanded an answer. She suddenly wondered how many quiet acts had gone unnoticed simply because they had never been placed inside a presentation. Shortly before lunch, Ethan checked the time on his wristwatch and stood. "I should head out," he said warmly. "Lily finishes school in a little while, and I promised we would stop by the library before dinner." Margaret reached into the cookie jar beside her chair and handed him 2 homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped carefully inside a napkin. "One for you and one for my favorite young lady," she said with a smile. Ethan laughed softly. "She is going to say you spoiled her again." Margaret winked. "That is exactly what grandmothers are supposed to do, even honorary ones." Olivia followed Ethan onto the front porch before he reached the walkway. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Rain clouds had disappeared, leaving soft sunlight reflecting across the quiet street. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "Why did you never tell anyone?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her with gentle confusion. "Tell them what?" "Everything you have been doing for Margaret." Ethan glanced back toward the house before answering. "Because it was never about me." Olivia searched his face for resentment, disappointment, or even satisfaction at seeing her surprised, but found none. "After everything that happened between us," she continued carefully, I thought you would want nothing to do with anyone connected to my family." Ethan rested one hand lightly on the porch railing. "Margaret did not fire me," he replied calmly. "She was simply an older neighbor who needed someone to knock on her door every morning. Life becomes much lighter when we stop making innocent people carry the weight of someone else's decisions." His words settled over the quiet neighborhood more heavily than any accusation ever could. There was no anger in his voice, no hidden criticism, only simple truth spoken with quiet dignity. Olivia felt her carefully built confidence begin to crack in ways no business challenge had ever managed. She had expected bitterness. She had prepared herself for blame. Instead, she found grace, and somehow that felt far more difficult to face. As Ethan walked toward his aging pickup truck, he lifted the insulated soup container that Margaret had already washed and returned. "Same time tomorrow," he called with an easy smile. Margaret waved happily from the front window. Olivia stood silently beside the open door, watching him drive away until the truck disappeared beyond the maple trees, realizing that some people measured success by promotions, while others measured it by whether someone felt less alone because they had shown up. The next morning arrived wrapped in soft gray clouds drifting over Seattle, and Olivia found herself waking earlier than usual. Instead of checking financial reports or answering electronic mail from the executive team, she sat quietly at Margaret's kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, watching the front window. At exactly 8 o'clock, the familiar blue pickup truck turned onto Maple Street. Ethan stepped out carrying a small paper grocery bag in one hand and a toolbox in the other. He smiled naturally when he noticed Olivia already waiting by the front door, as though yesterday's surprising reunion had become nothing more than another ordinary part of life. "Good morning," he said warmly. "The pharmacist called yesterday afternoon. Margaret's prescription was ready, so I picked it up before coming over." He handed the small pharmacy bag to Margaret without mentioning that he had already paid the remaining balance after learning her insurance had delayed reimbursement again. Margaret thanked him with a grateful smile, while Olivia quietly noticed the receipt folded inside the package. Ethan quickly changed the subject before anyone could comment. "I also brought fresh strawberries. Lily insisted they looked sweeter than the ones from last week." Margaret laughed. "That little girl has excellent judgment." Before long, Ethan noticed the back porch door sticking slightly whenever Margaret tried opening it. Without saying a word, he placed his toolbox on the floor, adjusted the hinges, tightened several loose screws, and carefully sanded the swollen wooden edge until the door opened smoothly again. He worked with steady hands and patient attention, stopping only when Margaret asked whether he wanted another cup of coffee. "Maybe after I finish replacing the burned-out porch light," he answered with an easy smile. Olivia followed him outside and watched him climb a short stepladder, carefully installing the new bulb before testing the fixture twice to make certain everything worked properly. He never hurried. He never complained. Every task received the same quiet respect regardless of how small it seemed. As they walked back toward the kitchen, Margaret spoke with the comfortable honesty that only comes from complete trust. "Last winter the furnace stopped working during the coldest weekend of the year," she said. "I was afraid I would have to spend thousands of dollars replacing it." Ethan smiled modestly without looking up. "It only needed a clogged filter and one worn ignition sensor." Margaret shook her head. "He drove across town in the middle of a snowstorm because I sounded worried on the telephone. He stayed until almost midnight just to make certain the house stayed warm." Olivia listened without interrupting. Later, while helping Margaret organize old family photographs, she opened a kitchen drawer searching for tape and instead found neatly arranged envelopes. Each contained receipts for groceries, hardware supplies, prescription co-payments, and home repairs. Most had one simple note written in Ethan's careful handwriting. "Paid. Do not worry." Olivia slowly looked toward the living room where Ethan was replacing the batteries inside a smoke detector. Margaret noticed her expression and spoke softly. "I have offered to repay every dollar. He always says exactly the same thing." Olivia closed the drawer gently. "What does he say?" Margaret smiled toward Ethan with unmistakable affection. "He tells me that kindness works best when it does not become a debt." Olivia felt those words settle deeply inside her heart. In every board meeting she had attended, value was measured by profit, growth, and return on investment. Standing inside her aunt's quiet home, she was beginning to understand another kind of wealth entirely, one built through ordinary mornings, patient hands, and promises kept long after everyone else had forgotten to knock. That evening, after driving Margaret home from a routine medical appointment and picking Lily up from the public library, Ethan returned to his small house with the peaceful satisfaction that came from another ordinary day well spent. Lily spread her homework across the kitchen table, while Ethan prepared grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and baked potatoes. Their conversations were simple, filled with school stories, favorite books, and plans for planting tomatoes once the weather became warmer. Nothing in their quiet home suggested that another life had once revolved around executive meetings and multi-million-dollar technology projects. Across the city, however, Olivia sat alone inside her office long after the last employee had gone home. The towering windows overlooked Seattle's evening skyline, but she barely noticed the lights below. Her thoughts remained inside Margaret's modest living room. She remembered the careful labels on medicine bottles, the repaired porch door, the fresh flowers beneath the windows, and the quiet confidence with which Ethan had completed every small task. Finally, she opened the company's archived personnel system and searched for Ethan Walker's employment records. She expected to find an average employee file that justified the decision she had made months earlier. Instead, she found years of performance evaluations filled with remarkably consistent observations. Dependable under pressure. Trusted by every department. Frequently assists co-workers without being asked. Resolves problems quietly before they become larger issues. Never seeks personal recognition. Curious, Olivia continued reading older project reports. Again and again, she discovered notes from managers thanking Ethan for staying late to help new employees understand complex systems, volunteering to cover emergency maintenance during holidays, and mentoring younger engineers whose confidence had been shaken after mistakes. One handwritten recommendation from a retired director caught her attention more than any performance score ever could. It read, "If you ever need someone who puts people before pride, call Ethan first." Olivia leaned back slowly, feeling an uncomfortable weight settle across her shoulders. She searched internal correspondence from the months leading to his dismissal. The economic downturn had forced difficult budget decisions, and she had relied heavily on efficiency reports, department rankings, and recommendations prepared by executives she barely knew after becoming chief executive officer. Ethan's name had appeared on a list of positions marked for elimination because his quiet personality supposedly lacked leadership visibility. At the time, she had accepted the recommendation without asking deeper questions. Now every page she opened revealed another example of invisible leadership that numbers alone had failed to measure. As midnight approached, Olivia closed the final report and sat quietly in the darkness of her office. She realized she had spent years believing leadership belonged to the loudest voices, the strongest presentations, and the people who knew how to impress a room. Ethan had quietly lived by a different definition altogether. Leadership, for him, meant arriving every morning with warm soup before anyone asked, repairing what was broken before anyone noticed, paying another person's bills without expecting repayment, and making certain an elderly neighbor never felt forgotten. The company had measured productivity. Margaret had experienced character. One could be calculated on spreadsheets. The other could only be witnessed through countless ordinary moments. Olivia slowly looked toward the framed mission statement hanging on her office wall, where words about integrity and service suddenly felt incomplete. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she wondered whether the greatest mistake of her career had not been losing an exceptional employee, but failing to recognize an exceptional human being while he had quietly stood right in front of her. The following morning, Olivia canceled 2 executive meetings for the first time since becoming chief executive officer. Her assistant looked surprised, but Olivia simply explained that something more important required her attention. She drove to Margaret's neighborhood carrying a small basket of fresh fruit, not because she believed gifts could erase regret, but because she wanted to begin showing up instead of merely thinking about what should have been done months earlier. Ethan had already arrived. He was standing on a short ladder trimming a loose tree branch that had begun scraping against Margaret's roof whenever the wind became strong. The steady rhythm of hand clippers echoed softly through the quiet street, while birds settled comfortably on nearby fences. Ethan climbed down carefully, smiled at Margaret, and asked whether the branch looked far enough away from the shingles. Margaret gave him an approving thumbs up from the porch swing. Olivia watched silently before walking toward them. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan nodded politely. "Good morning. Margaret tells me the weather should stay dry today, so it seemed like a good time to finish this." There was no awkwardness in his voice, no reminder of the past, only the calm courtesy he seemed to offer everyone. Margaret noticed the unusual seriousness on Olivia's face and quietly excused herself to prepare lemonade inside the house, leaving the two of them alone beneath the maple tree. For several moments, neither person spoke. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood, while children laughed somewhere in the distance on their way to a nearby park. Finally, Olivia took a slow breath. "I owe you something that should have been said a long time ago." Ethan looked at her with quiet attention, but did not interrupt. "I was wrong," she continued. "Not only about the decision I made, but about the way I judged you. I believed I understood leadership because I could read reports, study numbers, and evaluate presentations. I never took the time to understand the people behind them." Ethan rested the ladder against the garage wall before answering. "We all make decisions with the information we believe we have." Olivia gently shook her head. "No, I had enough opportunities to ask better questions. I simply chose the easier path." Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried genuine responsibility instead of excuses. "When I opened that door a few days ago, I expected an uncomfortable conversation. I never expected to discover that the person I underestimated had spent months quietly changing someone else's life." Ethan smiled softly as sunlight filtered through the leaves above them. "Margaret changed mine too," he replied. "After I lost my job, it would have been easy to spend every day thinking about what I no longer had. She gave me a reason to keep looking outward instead of inward. Sometimes helping another person is the quickest way to heal yourself." Olivia lowered her eyes, allowing those words to settle into the silence between them. They were simple, honest, and impossible to argue with. Margaret stepped back onto the porch carrying 3 tall glasses of homemade lemonade, completely unaware that something important had just shifted. Ethan accepted his glass with an appreciative smile, thanked her as he always did, and asked whether she wanted him to tighten the loose handle on the garden gate before leaving. Olivia watched him walk toward the fence with his toolbox once again in hand. He had just accepted a heartfelt apology without demanding anything in return, and before another minute had passed, he was already fixing one more small problem that nobody else had noticed. In that quiet moment, Olivia understood that true character was not revealed by how someone responded when life was easy, but by how faithfully they continued serving others after life had given them every reason to stop. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Olivia no longer visited Margaret only when her calendar allowed. She started arriving every Saturday morning with fresh groceries, stayed long enough to help prepare lunch, and listened more than she spoke. At first, Margaret teased her gently for finally learning how to slow down. Olivia laughed, admitting that she had spent years believing every hour needed to produce measurable results. Margaret simply smiled and replied, "Some of the best hours only produce memories." Ethan continued his routine exactly as before. Every morning he knocked 3 times, checked the house, brought fresh food whenever he could, and made certain Margaret never faced another day feeling forgotten. Nothing about his kindness became larger because Olivia was watching. It had never depended on an audience. One Saturday afternoon, Lily joined him after finishing a school science project. Carrying a small tray of homemade blueberry muffins, she walked confidently beside her father toward Margaret's front porch. The elderly woman welcomed her with open arms. "There is my favorite young baker," Margaret said with delight. Lily smiled shyly. "Dad helped mix the batter, but I decorated the tops." Olivia happened to be arranging fresh flowers on the dining room table when Lily entered. She watched the young girl hug Margaret naturally, as though they had known each other for years. Soon the 4 of them gathered around the kitchen table, sharing warm muffins, lemonade, and easy conversation. Lily described her dream of becoming an engineer because she loved solving puzzles. Ethan encouraged her curiosity without taking over the conversation, asking thoughtful questions instead of giving answers. Margaret proudly announced that Lily had inherited her father's patient mind. Olivia quietly noticed something she had overlooked during all the years she managed hundreds of employees. Ethan never tried to become the center of attention, whether speaking with a child, an elderly neighbor, or a company executive, he made other people feel heard first. As the afternoon sunlight filled the kitchen, Margaret excused herself to rest for a while. Lily volunteered to wash the dishes before Ethan could even ask. Olivia stood beside her drying plates with a kitchen towel. "Your father must be very proud of you," she said warmly. Lily smiled without looking up from the sink. "He always tells me that being kind is more important than being impressive. He says people remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you say." Olivia paused with a porcelain plate still in her hands. The sentence sounded remarkably similar to everything she had witnessed over the past several weeks. It was not something Ethan merely believed. It was the way he lived every ordinary day. Later that afternoon, Ethan repaired a loose board on Margaret's garden bench, while Lily carefully watered the flowers they had planted together earlier that spring. Olivia joined them, kneeling in the soil without worrying that dirt covered the sleeves of her expensive jacket. Margaret watched quietly from the porch with a contented smile that reflected years of hard-earned wisdom. She realized that none of them had gathered because of business, obligation, or circumstance. They were there because simple acts of care had slowly woven 4 different lives together into something that felt remarkably like family. Standing beneath the gentle shade of the maple tree, Olivia understood that true leadership had never been about convincing people to follow. It began much earlier, with the quiet decision to serve without expecting recognition, trusting that kindness planted faithfully each day would eventually grow into respect that no title alone could ever earn. Summer gradually settled over Seattle, bringing longer evenings and golden light that lingered across Maple Street well past dinner. Margaret's health improved with each passing week. She laughed more easily, walked farther with her cane, and no longer seemed anxious about facing each day alone. Her doctor remarked that medicine certainly helped, but regular companionship had become just as important. Margaret simply smiled and replied that kindness was sometimes the best prescription a person could receive. Ethan continued balancing work, fatherhood, and his daily visits with the same steady rhythm that had guided him for months. Every morning he knocked 3 times. Every afternoon he picked Lily up from school, and every evening he made certain there was enough time left for homework, dinner, and conversation around the kitchen table. Olivia also found herself changing in quiet ways that surprised even her closest colleagues. Inside Sterling Technologies, employees began noticing small differences. Executive meetings no longer ended with only financial targets. Olivia started asking managers a different question before approving promotions. Who quietly helps everyone else succeed? At first, the room often became silent. People searched for names that had rarely appeared in presentations or quarterly reports. Olivia encouraged them to look beyond confidence and recognize consistency, generosity, and integrity. She introduced a mentorship program where experienced employees could guide younger team members without competing for recognition. She also established paid volunteer days, encouraging every department to support local neighborhoods, schools, and senior centers. When several executives questioned whether those changes would improve productivity, Olivia answered calmly. A company becomes stronger when people remember they are serving human beings, not only numbers. One Saturday afternoon, she visited Ethan while he and Lily were repainting Margaret's white picket fence. Buckets of fresh paint sat beside neatly trimmed flower beds, while soft music drifted from an old radio resting on the porch steps. Olivia picked up a paintbrush without asking permission and quietly joined them. For several minutes, the only sounds were gentle laughter, birds singing from nearby trees, and the smooth strokes of brushes moving across weathered wood. Finally, Olivia set her brush down and looked toward Ethan. "I have been thinking about something for weeks," she said. "I would like to offer you a position at Sterling Technologies again." Ethan listened politely without interrupting. "Not because I feel guilty," Olivia continued, "and not because I believe this erases the past. I simply know our company would become better with someone like you helping shape its future." Ethan smiled thoughtfully before answering. "I appreciate that more than you probably realize." He glanced toward Lily, who was carefully painting the last fence post while Margaret applauded her progress from the porch swing. "But my priorities look different now than they did before." Olivia nodded with understanding. Ethan continued gently. "If I returned full-time, I would lose the mornings that belonged to Margaret and the afternoons that belonged to Lily. Those hours cannot be replaced. Olivia remained quiet, respecting the weight of his words. After a brief moment, Ethan offered another idea. If your younger engineers ever need guidance, I would be happy to mentor them a few days each month. I can share what I know without giving up the life that has taught me what matters most. Olivia's face brightened with genuine gratitude. That sounds exactly like something you would suggest, she replied with a warm smile. As the sun settled lower beyond the maple trees, the freshly painted fence seemed to glow in the evening light. Margaret looked at the three adults standing beside one another and softly whispered to Lily, "Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive by changing where people live. They arrive by changing what people value." Lily smiled, looking proudly toward her father, knowing he had quietly taught that lesson long before anyone else had finally learned to see it. Autumn arrived quietly, covering Maple Street with shades of amber, crimson, and gold, yet some things never changed. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Ethan Walker still parked his aging pickup truck beside the curb, stepped onto the familiar walkway with fresh bread or homemade soup in his hands, and knocked gently 3 times before opening the door with Margaret's cheerful invitation. Only now, another smile often greeted him from inside the house. Olivia had rearranged her schedule so she could spend at least one morning each week with her aunt, and those visits gradually became the most valuable appointments on her calendar. Margaret often joked that she had accidentally created the smallest family reunion in Seattle, and no one ever argued with her. Lily continued growing into the thoughtful young woman her father had quietly encouraged her to become. She excelled in school, spent afternoons reading engineering books from the public library, and never forgot to bake oatmeal cookies whenever Margaret's favorite recipe called for extra cinnamon. Ethan accepted his role as a mentor at Sterling Technologies exactly as he had promised. A few mornings each month, he visited the company, guiding younger engineers with patience instead of pride. He never introduced himself by mentioning past achievements. Instead, he listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and helped others discover solutions for themselves. Before long, employees noticed that the calm confidence spreading through their teams came not from impressive speeches, but from simple habits of respect, preparation, and generosity. Olivia watched the transformation with quiet gratitude. The culture inside the company slowly changed because people finally understood that character could become contagious when someone chose to live it consistently. One crisp October afternoon, Sterling Technologies held its annual employee appreciation gathering in a nearby community park instead of an expensive downtown ballroom. Families were invited. Children played beneath colorful trees, and volunteers from local senior centers shared lunch with employees. Margaret arrived wearing a bright blue sweater that Lily had chosen for her birthday. As everyone gathered beneath a large maple tree, Olivia stepped onto the small wooden platform prepared for welcoming remarks. She looked across the crowd before setting her prepared speech aside. "Today," she said calmly, "I plan to speak about growth, innovation, and another successful year. Those things matter. But I have learned that the strongest organizations are not built by the smartest strategies alone. They are built by people who quietly care for others long before anyone notices." She turned toward Ethan, who stood beside Lily and Margaret with the same humble expression he always carried. "Several months ago, I failed to recognize that kind of person. I judged visibility instead of character. I measured performance without seeing compassion. I was wrong." The audience remained completely silent, not because they were uncomfortable, but because honesty deserved their full attention. Ethan simply smiled and gave a small respectful nod, asking for nothing more. Later that afternoon, after everyone returned home, Ethan followed his familiar routine one last time before sunset. He walked to Margaret's front porch carrying a container of warm soup. Before he could knock, the front door opened. Margaret stood in the middle with Lily on one side and Olivia on the other, all three smiling as though they had been waiting for him. Warm lights spilled from the house behind them, filling the porch with the comforting glow of home. Ethan looked at the three women who had become such an important part of his life and quietly smiled back. There were no dramatic celebrations, no grand rewards, and no perfect endings waiting beyond that doorway. There was something far more lasting. There was forgiveness freely given, respect honestly earned, and the quiet certainty that every act of kindness had been building this moment all along. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. It is continuing to do what is right until even the people who once misunderstood you finally learn to knock on someone else's door.